Welcome to today's webinar, hosted on the NCTSN Learning Center for Child and Adolescent Trauma. My name is Tracy Henderson Bethel, and I will be facilitating today's webinar. For anyone wishing to receive CE credit for this training, no hard copies will be mailed. The National Center for Child Traumatic Stress is approved by the American Psychological Association and the National Board of Certified Counselors to offer CE credits. Today's webinar, Attachment and Developmentally Informed and Socio-Culturally Responsive Strategies and Interventions for Young Children, is part of the Trauma-Informed Care for Unaccompanied Children webinar series. This webinar was developed in collaboration with the Irving Harris Foundation and Carmen Rosa Noroña, Child Clinical Trauma Services and Training Lead, Child Witness to Violence Project at the Boston Medical Center. Marta Casas, psychotherapist and consultant in private practice, and Dr. Marcy Safyer, Director of the Center for Children and Families at the Erickson Institute. Today, Carmen Rosa Noroña and Dr. Marcy Safyer will be presenting. Marta Casas and Carmen Rosa Noroña will present the Spanish version of this webinar. After today's webinar, we hope that participants will be able to, 1, increase their understanding about the intersection of historical, intergenerational, and immigration trauma in young migrant children. 2, identify the long and short-term effects, for instance, cognitive, socio-emotional, psychological, and relational levels, of immigrant-related trauma, including forcibly separations on young children. 3, describe and implement developmentally, relationally, trauma and diversity-informed strategies aimed at increasing a sense of safety, affect regulation, and hope in these children. And now I am going to pass the rest of this webinar on, starting with Dr. Marcy Safyer.
Might have experienced potentially traumatic events prior, during, and after migration. The very young children in your care are communicating their needs in ways that may be confusing and difficult to understand. We know that we can reach them by understanding what they have been through and providing appropriate developmental strategies that build on the children's strengths, keeping in mind their linguistic needs and socio-cultural background. Sometimes working with these children is distressing for staff. Empathic people often feel distressed when working with traumatized young children. The effective use of these strategies can help lessen both staff and children's distress. Next slide.
This is Carmen Rosa Noroña. So let's think now about the context that is surrounding these children. Since 2017 in the United States, as we know, there have been changes in immigration policies and practices that have led to an increase of young children who are in care and who were separated from their parents or guardians at the border. Young children rely on supportive and predictable caregivers to meet their basic needs, and the separation from a caregiver can exacerbate prior traumatic stressors and have a devastating effect in the child's development and functioning, and these effects can be short-term effects and long-term effects. It's important to remember that the children that are in your care may carry stories of loss, trauma, significant trauma, but they also carry stories of strength and of resiliency. And that strength is coming from factors that are related to their family, to their culture, to their community, and also to themselves. We also know that young children are best understood and helped in their recovery in the context of supportive and predictable relationships. So even when children have experienced the loss of a parent, in this case through separation, it's so important to create spaces and relationships where they can feel understood and safe, so then they can feel better and recover from the separation from the caregivers as much as possible, and most of all, make meaning of their experience. Young migrant separated children constitute a special population because of all the factors that I just mentioned before. And as practitioners and as people who are trying to support them, it's important to learn how to understand their very particular needs and use whatever we know, and adapt whatever we know to those needs. Next slide, please. So now the lens that we are going to use for this presentation is a multi-lens, or rather we are going to use a framework that has multiple lenses, where we want to hold, as I was mentioning before, a developmental lens. We want to hold a socio-cultural lens. We want to hold a lens of self-awareness as practitioners, and then a lens of historical understanding of how, in this case, I am going to explain in this slide how historical trauma might be playing a role in how a child might be presenting. And all of these is reflecting also a social justice and diversity-informed approach. So in thinking about a diversity-informed lens, it's important to understand the connection between historical and intergenerational trauma, and maybe you are familiar with these terms, and I am going to try to flesh them out as we think about the population of children that we are discussing today. So we know that many, or at least this is the population that we are more aware of now, that there are hundreds of families and thousands of families and children who are crossing the south border, and that the majority of those families are coming from the Northern Triangle, which is El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And it is important to understand that people are leaving these the Northern Triangle because of the levels of mainly violence that is manifested in different ways in each of these countries. And that violence is the result, if we look from a historical perspective, of colonization, and then a number of wars and massacres that happened during the 60s and the 80s in these countries. So the violence that we are seeing today is the result of many, many years, hundreds of years of colonization and violence that has really affected the fabric of these societies and has affected families and communities, and this is why people are leaving. Next slide, please. So if we think about, again, about historical trauma, and I am going to read the definition. Historical trauma refers to the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding of the soul wounding over the lifespan across generations emanating from massive group trauma. So thinking again about the families that are coming from the Northern Triangle, many of these families come from indigenous communities or communities that have been oppressed for hundreds of years, and that during the times of the massacres and the Civil War were the target of the aggressions and the genocide. So when we think about historical trauma, these are mechanisms of oppression that are targeted to a particular group because of their religion, their race, their gender identity, and these aggression and this violence is sustained, and it can happen over generations, and this is what has happened to many of these communities. And unfortunately, that affects how, for instance, how parents and children relate to each other. So one of the manifestations of historical trauma is intergenerational trauma. So when I think about intergenerational trauma, I am thinking about relationships that can be where there is aggression, or relationships where the attachment or the relationship is affected in ways where parents and children don't see each other or they don't understand each other. So the child that might be at your center might have been experiencing some relational issues. And those relational issues might have been in the family. So this is very important to understand as we are thinking about this group of children that might be in your care. Historical trauma might not have affected them, but then it's important to understand, again, from this historical perspective, how oppression is affecting a whole generation of people, and the children of these people might be in your care. Next slide, please. So I have already mentioned this, that unfortunately historical trauma has an impact over generations, and it has an impact not only in terms of mental health, but then also how people cope with stressors in life and how they relate to each other and how they interpret the world. Next slide, please. So what happens when you have experienced, your community has experienced historical trauma, and then also you are living with violence, and then you are forced to leave? Immigration in itself is it involves losses in the base case scenario. But then, as we also know, the families who are crossing the border and children who become unaccompanied children or that came without an adult experience a number of very significant stressors during their journey to, in this case, to the United States. So all of that is having an impact on the way that they are interpreting the world, and then also themselves, because it's an accumulative trauma or traumatic stressors, and then once they arrived into the country, in this case the United States, they might face separation from their caregivers, but then also rejection in so many ways, and many times, based on the stories that I hear from my clients who I see in therapy, they might experience discrimination and rejection, which has a profound effect in their identity. And for young children, if they are witnessing that their parents are being rejected, they have the perception that their parents are in danger, that also has a profound sense in their identity. And then also if they are listening to words that are negative words about the group that they belong to, that also has an impact on their identity. So that is why we have to be so careful and avoid using words like aliens, illegal immigrants, and words like that, because those children are listening, and that those words affect their identity. Next slide, please. So why does culture matter? Why do we want to think about culture? So if we think about trauma, traumatic experiences really overwhelm us, and they, as a result of that, the meaning of however we were understanding the world changes. So that is why we are saying that trauma disrupts meaning. Things don't make sense anymore. And one of the things that can help restore meaning are, as we will continue discussing in this presentation, are relationships. So for young children, they understand the world, or begin to understand the world through their relationships. But those relationships are part of a socio-cultural context that help us to understand the world. So it doesn't matter in which part of the world we are. We all have a culture, and our families have a culture, and that is allowing us to understand what are the rules and how we need to move every day and to interpret the world. So if trauma is disrupting meaning, relationships are helping to make or to understand what has happened to us, and culture is so fundamental to help us also recover after we have experienced a trauma, so a traumatic event. So, we can think about if you are feeling very overwhelmed at times, or even if you are feeling sad, there are certain things that your family did or that you did as a child that bring a sense of comfort. And if we think at a more profound level, when we have experienced something that has overwhelmed us, to include aspects of those things that helped us to understand who we were and that are part of our culture, have a very significant positive effect. And familiarity can be communicated through language. That is why it's so important to, in thinking about these children, to have providers who can work with them in their mother language or the language of the place where these children are coming from. But sometimes that is not possible. But there are so many ways in which we can communicate with a young child through our body language, through pictures, through music, through games that now there are a number of games available through, thanks to globalization, we can have access to music and to cultural cultural games and that can help a child have a sense of familiarity, and we will talk more about that. And I think that most importantly, it's just to have a sense of curiosity and to be to try to understand and just have a curiosity in where are these children coming from, what is the geographical context, and so we can keep those factors in mind as we are trying to get to know these children. Thank you. Next slide. So in thinking about all of these, one of the most important aspects is to, as we think about diversity-informed practice, is to think about ourselves and start with ourselves, and to reflect on the values and beliefs that we bring as a result of our own families, as a result of our own socio-cultural context, and then also as a result of our training in what we have learned, for instance, about child development. If, it's important to ask if what we learned about particular expectations about development is going to really help the child who is in front of us, or maybe we need to open our minds to trying to understand all these factors that I mentioned before, where the child is coming from, what was the historical and geographical context, how their parents might have expected developmental stages, and most of all, to have our expectations in check, as we know that implicit biases are so powerful in becoming obstacles in our work. And I am going to read then number 1, that is a principle or an aspirational principle of a series of principles that were created by the Irving Harris Foundation and a group of people who are interested in diversity-informed practice. And it reads, self-awareness leads to better services for families. Working with infants, children, and families requires all individuals, organizations, and systems of care to reflect on our culture, values, and beliefs, and on the impact that racism, classism, sexism, ableism, homophobia, xenophobia, and other systems of oppression have had in our lives in order to provide diversity-informed, culturally attuned services. So again, what we are trying to communicate with this is the importance of keeping our values and beliefs, of being aware of those values and beliefs and how they are impacting our work and in our practice. Thank you. Next slide.
Will help. Think about it. This is Marcy Safyer. I'm going to be talking about attachment. It is another one of the foundational lenses that will help to better understand what the children in your care are going through and why. We are, as are the children in your care, biologically predisposed to depend on parents or important caregivers for survival and emotional well-being. The babies in your care rely on others to survive, and relationships are built as caregivers respond to the baby's needs. So when they're with their parents, they are developing those early relationships. Most people have a primary attachment figure that serves as the infant or young child's protective shield. I think what is important about this relationship is that it's not interchangeable with other caregivers, although in some societies the relationship is developed with one caregiver and supported by just a few others, and in other societies this relationship can be supported by multiple caregivers. Given that infants are predisposed to depend on caregivers, any breakdown in caregiving or in this primary attachment relationship is serious. I think that although it may look different in different cultures, what is really important to understand about it is that this relationship is for safety and protection, and that they develop through reciprocal interactions between a caregiver and an infant. So it starts out that a young child needs to be soothed, calmed, and made to feel safe when they are upset. The caregiver is the person who is there to help them soothe and settle. And over time, the child learns to expect that someone is going to be there to soothe and settle them, and they feel safe, emotionally safe, and physically safe. So with the threat of caregiver unavailability, children feel very anxious and angry. And we'll talk more as we go on about how they communicate their anxious and angry feelings through behaviors and what we can do to help them feel safe again. Next slide. We're going to do a short reflection exercise to try to really understand a child's experience. So if you can all imagine that you are a child again and you're with your own mother, what would it be like if one day she disappeared? What would that be like for you? How would you feel? And I think most importantly, think about if someone else came along who was a stranger. Would they really be able to take her place? What would that feel like inside? What might your experience of that stranger be? Now, pause a minute and think about who could help you if you were in that situation. How would that person feel different than your mother, your grandmother, or important people in your life who always took care of you? I think it really helps to understand this concept because as much as children need someone to care for them if they have lost their caregiver, it's I think a little bit easier to understand. You think that you just can't take out one mother and plug in another, that there's this very deep connection for protection and safety that that has disappeared. And what can we do for children to help them when that bond has really been taken from them? Next slide. I'm going to talk again now about emotional and behavioral regulation as another lens to think about the children that you are caring for. So emotional regulation is the capacity to organize and manage one's emotions. And similarly, behavioral regulation is the capacity to organize and manage one's behaviors. Both of these capacities develop over time in the context of predictable and sensitive relationships. It's that attachment relationship that these capacities develop within. And before an infant or young child can self-regulate, they co-regulate with an adult who soothes and helps them cope with ideally a manageable amount of stress. So a child's ability to calm him or herself down and wait for help is something that the child learns over time. And ideally in a situation where a child is not expected to cope with more than they can handle, so that they have can make baby steps to cope with what they can handle, and then more things come their way, and they're able to kind of build their capacity to manage their own emotions and behavior. So every time a caregiver consistently attends to an infant or young child's needs, the child learns to expect that their needs will be met, and they do not get overwhelmed, and they build this capacity to organize their emotions. So if a child is hungry and someone feeds them, or they cry and let somebody know that something's wrong, the person can figure that out, and then they calm down. They begin to build this capacity to regulate, to expect that someone's going to help them. They don't have to kind of be anxious and scared about that, and they can calm down. Emotional self-regulation develops through these reciprocal, soothing, and calming experiences with an important caregiver. And what happens is that while children are very young, they're not capable of regulating their own behaviors or emotions. Their little brains are not developed enough to do that themselves, and they need a grown-up who they trust to help them feel or behave more calmly and help the child's brain build the capacity to calm down and cope. This is called co-regulation. And what happens with a lot of the kids that are currently in your care who are little is that they have not developed this capacity on their own completely, and yet the person who they were in a close attachment relationship with, who was the person who was helping them develop this capacity, has now disappeared, and their anxiety and anger and worry is making them feel more dysregulated. They have more overwhelming emotions. Their behaviors to communicate how they are managing are bigger, and so they need help regulating, but they're in a place where the reason that they need help regulating is their co-regulator has disappeared. And so we will talk more later about the kinds of strategies that you can all use to help children continue to develop this capacity. But it's really important to understand that it's not simply that they're away from their caregiver, but they also are not old enough to have the capacity to regulate themselves yet. Next slide. So we're now going to talk about trauma for the infants and young children in your care. I'm going to just read the definition first of trauma. So trauma is when an infant or young child experiences an event that causes actual harm or that the child perceives is to pose a serious threat to their emotions or physical safety. The child witnesses an event that harms or could harm someone critically important to them. So it's really important to understand that for a child, the degree of trauma that they experience is determined by their perception. It may be that their parent or the person that they love is not in physical danger, but if a child perceives that they are, that is what's going to make the event so terrifying for them. And socio-cultural practices and expectations also play a role in their perception. So a prolonged separation from a primary caregiver may not be a threat to the physical integrity, but it is likely to be experienced as if it was. If you think about attachment again, and the job of the parent is the protective shield for the child, losing that parent emotionally and physically is going to feel to the child like there's a threat to their survival. Next slide. So to tie together some earlier concepts, trauma and emotion regulation, we know that traumatic effects overwhelm an infant or young child's capacity to cope. So trauma elicits feelings of terror, powerlessness, and out of control physiological arousal, particularly if the trauma is due to the loss of a child's attachment figure. So the internal processes can be seen and understood for an infant or young child as sort of this dysregulation of emotions and behaviors. When infants and young children are in chaotic environments and they're separated from their primary caregiver, every aspect of their development can be compromised because they rely on their caregiver to help them. So when we think about children kind of falling apart, it's because they don't have that, literally don't have that other person there to kind of hold them together. And again, just recall we talked about in terms of attachment and emotion regulation, they don't have the capacity to cope. They don't have the capacity to calm themselves down. And so when the trauma is the disappearance of a child's mother or primary caregiver, you see what I think you're all struggling with in the care of the kids that you see, and that they're having such a difficult time being able to settle down and to soothe, and sometimes they seem inconsolable. And we will again talk later in this webinar about some strategies that you can use to help them calm down. Next slide.
So now I am going to talk about the sign or symptoms or manifestations that a young child might be showing us when they have experienced events that are traumatic or when they are under a lot of stress. It's important to remember and to be aware that young children are not protected from traumatic events because they are young, and that they are showing us how they are feeling through behaviors. And when the younger that a child is, it might be more subtle. So we have listed here a number of signs that are following a developmental trajectory. So if we think about very young babies, like newborns, they can show us that when they are under stress, and then we can tell that by changes in their skin color, by changes in their bodily functions. Like sometimes when babies are feeling overwhelmed, they might be sneezing a lot or vomiting a lot, or they might become colicky or very fussy. And children, when they are feeling very sad or very angry or very confused, they might be crying inconsolably. They might get withdrawn. And an important reflection is that children from birth to age 5 are changing constantly. So if you have a 6-month-old who has experienced a traumatic event or a series of traumatic events, her or his behaviors are going to be very different than those of a 2 or a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old who are already moving and have the possibility, for instance, to run away. Some of the effects of traumatic events are that people or humans might freeze, when a human being or a child or any of faces a danger, we can freeze, we can run away, we can fight, or we can just submit. But to do all of these, if you want to run away, you have to have the possibility of moving. And if we think about a very young child, they don't have the possibility of running away or fighting, so they either freeze or submit, and that is why babies sometimes or very young kids can look withdrawn and or very quiet, and those kids might be easier to handle or manage, but those are the kids that we also want to pay attention to, as maybe they are telling us that they are very scared or that something really terrible happened to them. So these other symptoms like nightmares or increased clinginess, new fears, or becoming very anxious about anything, or becoming afraid of things that a child was not afraid of before, are also manifestations of fear and confusion, and that something wrong might have happened to a child. So the children that you might be caring for might show these signs. They might show repetitive play or repetitive behavior, a way in which children many times are trying to make a sense of what happened to them is through play. So it's not unusual to see that a child is repeating a scene that might have happened to them or that they witnessed through their play. And paying attention or being able to concentrate is also affected, and then that has an implication for learning. And they might have mastered developmental milestones. For instance, maybe they were potty trained, and then after being separated of their parents, they might have regressions in that area. They might stop talking, or they might appear in their development younger than their age, and in general, they might have a very hard time managing their emotions and their behaviors, and they might not be able to connect with you immediately. And again, if we hold that historical perspective that I was mentioning before, the way that they connect to people, or the way that in their family attachments happen, or relationships happen, might have been different, might have had a different presentation. So also it's important to be aware of what are your expectations in terms of connecting to a child and how the child is going to be responding to you. Next slide, please. So now I want to introduce you to Luisito, and I am going to share his story, and then we are going to look at a timeline to illustrate some of the traumatic events that happened to him, and then we invite you to hold him in mind as we are discussing strategies in the next section. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. You can skip this slide. Thank you. So Luisito is an indigenous Mayan little boy. He is 24 months old. His primary language is Zacateco. He speaks some Spanish, and then he has begun to learn some English. Until prior to migration, he lived with his mom, Isabel, who is 18 years old, the maternal grandparents, and his aunts in a rural area of Guatemala. The biological father left the family when Luisito was about 12 months old, and this man was emotionally and physically abusive to Isabel, and then also to Luisito. Isabel and Luisito left Guatemala after they witnessed a murder while they were waiting for a bus. The killer identified the mom, and he began to send threats to the family, saying that he was going to kill Luisito. So the family sold whatever they could, and they got in debt to be able to pay for a smuggler to bring Luisito and his mom to the United States. After 4 months of a very difficult journey, Luisito and his mom arrived into the U.S. border, and they were detained and separated, and Luisito was placed in a government government custody. So if we look at this trauma timeline, if we think again about he belongs to a indigenous community, so we can think about how there is the cumulative historical and intergenerational trauma possibility, and then that there was domestic violence and a lot of stressors in utero. And then when he was 12 months, there was more abuse, physical abuse, emotionally abuse, and he was the target of that. Next slide, please. And then the father leaves, and as a result of that, the family faces a number of stressors and poverty. Then between 15 and 24 months, all these events happen to him. He witnesses a murder. He is separated from his aunts, his grandparents, and I am just guessing that I am not sure if there was anyone who was helping him to make sense of what was happening or explaining to him why they were living in developmentally appropriate ways, because I imagine that his mom was under a lot of stress and they were just thinking about survival. And then they go through this very difficult journey where he actually witnesses his mother's sexual assault, and then the detention at the border and the separation from his mommy. Next slide, please. So he appears very, let's think about some of the signs and symptoms that we listed before, and let's think about his age. So he's 24 months, and he appears disoriented, frozen. He gets easily startled with noises, movement, or anything new. And he wakes up many times during the night. He's crying. He cries inconsolably, and as a result of that, he often throws up. And when you try to soothe him or pick him up, he kicks and bites and cries more. And sometimes when people are trying to talk to him and to explain what is happening, he turns his head around. He is trying to avoid any stimuli sometimes, and then he doesn't eat by himself, or he doesn't help with getting dressed or with any self-help skills. Next slide, please. So this is his presentation when he is in care, and the staff who are caring for him are reporting that they are very concerned about his sadness, that there is concern about all these difficulties with sleeping and feeding. They feel very puzzled because none of the attempts they are making to connect with him seem to be working, and talking to him or offering activities seem to overwhelm him, and he doesn't seem to understand directions, and he's not talking. So some of the staff are wondering if he has autism. However, there are some things that are working. He seems to eat better if someone feeds him. He's interested in picture books. He seems to do better when there are less people around him, and he likes to take warm baths. And at one point, one person was able to hold his hand after the person approached him in a very gentle way and used words in Spanish, and the person said, "Vamos, Luisito," and then he held this person's hand. So these are little ports of entry, and we can that can give us hope as we think about how we can help Luisito. Next slide, please. So now a reflection. How do you think that historical trauma is impacting or has impacted Luisito's life and is impacting his current presentation? What are your thoughts about the strengths and protective factors for him? What do you think he's telling us with his behavior? What is the meaning of these behaviors? And then what are your thoughts about the staff who is trying to help Luisito? How, if you were one of these persons working with him, what would you need to be able to support Luisito? And then, in general, how can we all help Luisito and children like him? And I know that during this webinar, we are really focusing on trying to understand what are the meaning of the behaviors and experience for these young children who came as unaccompanied minors or who were separated from their parents. And in the case of those, particularly of those children who were separated at the border, one of the ideas that I also want to bring is let's keep in mind also his mother. Let's imagine how she is feeling now, what she might be wondering, how she is also understanding or making sense of where Luisito is, what is happening to him. And I am bringing this up because hopefully he might, Luisito might get reunified with his mom, and these might be some of the questions that the mom had, regarding how he was doing when he was in care. And so it's important to keep the parents in mind as we might have the possibility of communicating with that parent at some point and easing some of the anxieties that parents usually have after they have been separated from their kids and their kids have been placed in care. Next slide, please. Now I am passing the presentation to Marcy.
Okay. So we have talked about the framework and some of the impact of immigration trauma on young children, and then illustrated for you some of the realities through the story of Luisito. And now we're going to look at some strategies that staff can use to help support very young children like Luisito who are in your care. But I'm going to ask you to really think about Luisito as we go through these strategies, and to start to, again, take a minute to think about Luisito's experience in the facility, in your care. His mother is gone. So what is it like for him to have these staff people around, really to have you all strangers that are trying your hardest to support him, and to help him really make sense out of what is going on. So I'm gonna start with talking about the environmental strategies, and then we'll talk about some other approaches. But I think, so for starters, when a child comes into care, an organization really needs to think about their role as the protective shield for the child as the child's parent is gone, and so each individual, but also generally the environment, needs to think about what are the kinds of things that need to be in place so that a child can feel as safe as possible given all the experiences that they're going through. We can think about creating a physical environment that is both developmentally informed and culturally responsive. As Carmen talked about earlier, trauma really disrupts culture, and thinking about being a culturally responsive environment disrupts order. We think about being culturally responsive and creating an environment that feels more familiar for children so that they can feel safer. Also, it's very important for children to come into an environment where there are rituals and routines so that they can begin to know that there's some order that they can count on. Those have to do with feeding, eating, sleeping, bathing, and playing at certain times in a regular way that is set up for developmentally appropriate needs of children, so that there are routines that make sense for their age, toys that are appropriate for babies, rattles for kids as they're older, child-friendly materials and toys. I think that you want to think about decor after thinking about socio-cultural and developmental needs of the children. one of the things that can help if there are language barriers are to have pictures around so that children know where things go and how to find things, how to put things away, to find materials that help to provide relational and emotional safety, and support self-soothing behaviors. So you want to provide materials or toys that have a cultural connection with the child, and provide things that are soft, blankets, stuffed animals. Bubbles are always a good activity that helps. Children are fascinated by bubbles, and it helps to develop relationships and provide opportunities for interaction if kids can move around. And then to really be able to really tune into kids and see what it is that will help them feel settled, to find quiet spaces, the opportunity for kids to not have to interact if they're alone, but to stay near, and just to really think about the environment in a way that you can create spaces that are child-friendly, and plan around their ages, developmental, and language capacities. Next slide.
So if we think about environmental strategies and thinking about triggers, particularly with kids who have experienced traumatic events, it's very important to be aware that anything really for a young child can potentially trigger them, can potentially set them off. So if we think about Luisito, we can imagine that he doesn't like loud noises. He doesn't like physical touch yet. He doesn't respond when he is being talked constantly or by different people. That seems to overwhelm him. So in his case, I would be paying attention to him. And then for young kids, also emotions, like feeling very sad or very angry or sometimes very happy. Those can be internal triggers. And we have also to pay attention to what we are saying because they are listening. So, for instance, if they are hearing that someone is saying something negative about their parents or about the children, that can be triggering. It's important to pay attention to the ratio of adults versus children, how many people how many adults are in a room in relation to a young child, how many strangers we are exposing children to. After working with families who have endured political and trauma, I know that a lot of the families that I serve get very triggered by sirens and by people who are in uniform, police officers, or in general by many times by men, or by being with a lot of people. So it's important to pay attention to that, to pay attention to hand and body gestures. You might be trying to approach a child and they might interpret a hand gesture as aggressive. And then, as Marcy was saying, just to have these awareness that routines or changes in routines can be very distressful for young kids, that transitions are unavoidable, transitions need to happen, but the way that children are living that or interpreting that can be very upsetting. So we can use words to or create a narrative around transitions, or try to support them a little bit more if we are anticipating that there is going to be a transition, and prepare them for that. And we are going to talk more about that. Next slide, please. So what are some of the things that you can implement in your center or at work? And I am sure that many of you are already practicing some of these recommendations. But in general, to avoid exposing the child to unpredictable changes. So as much as possible, try, if we think from a relational perspective, to try to assign them to one person or a special person that is going to be paying attention to them, or is going to be spending more time with them, and then help them to become familiar with different staff members. If a staff member is going to be absent and this is a staff member with whom they have made a connection, to let them know that that person is not going to be in the center for a while. If, for instance, the person is going on vacation, and then use pictures or calendars, pictures with everyone in the staff that can be posted in places where the children can see, and then use that system of pictures to, like a game, to indicate who is going to be here today, who is not going to be here next week, and then verbalize also these. So, for instance, the example is showing, today Ava will keep you safe and play with you, and tomorrow Santiago will return. Santiago went on vacation, or he went home. And then because of the circumstances, it might happen that a peer or might be reunified or moved from one facility to another. So that can be very upsetting to a young child, because it's a reminder of a loss. So also to try to prepare them as much as possible regarding those changes. And again, help them understand the routines that are part of the center. So it's important to remember that, again, that the children came through from a very difficult journey where they probably didn't have a lot of routines for eating or sleeping, and then that prior to that, we don't know what were the routines in their socio-cultural context, so they would need some time to get adjusted to the routines in your center, and then also to get support around understanding them. So again, the importance of having developmentally appropriate pictures, and then finding different ways of communicating, and Marcy and I have mentioned a few of these ways. And again, books and images are very important. Puppets, play, creating a verbal story is important. And again, it depends on the child. We need to pay attention if sometimes by talking a lot and trying in our attempt to describe the world, we might be overwhelming the child. So just to be very aware of that. And then it's very important to help them develop a vocabulary about feelings and name those feelings, so then they can also make meaning of what they are experiencing. Next slide, please.
to continue talking about what Carmen has just begun to talk about, to think about what children are feeling and help them really find a way to express that and develop a vocabulary for that feeling. To try to really stay in tune with what a child is feeling really helps to build feelings of trust and security. If they feel that you understand them, then it will be easier for them to communicate what they need to and to begin to feel more safe and settled. I think, the children in your care, and I'm sure you're already doing this as well, are showing you all a different range of behaviors that are letting you know what is going on. And so to begin to really, consider what is the socio-cultural, developmental, or trauma factors that are being communicated to you through this behavior. Sometimes to step back and look at how the child is and think, how are they feeling? What is it that they need you to understand so that you can respond in a certain way? Allow children to express their feelings in verbally and non-verbally, and find ways to reassure them that these big feelings are okay when scary things happen. And that you can understand that they may feel physically uncomfortable. And I think a really important one is to help children feel connected with their family and culture. So as we've talked about before, try to understand the foods, activities, and routines that you can that would help them feel closer to the traditions. But I think also to not be afraid to talk about their family, to talk about how much they miss their mommy. So when children show you that they have these very deep feelings through their behavior and they can't verbalize their feelings, speak for them out loud. Speaking for young children can be very helpful to be able to say, I see how sad you are. I know you must be missing your mommy very much. I know your mommy is missing you too, and she is trying hard to find you. As we talk about how odd it must be for these kids for their parent to just disappear out of their lives, it's important to talk about the fact that their mom exists as someone who they do miss, to help have their mom still be on their mind, or their dad, or their grandma. And I know it's not clear all the time how much information you may even have about who took care of this baby before they came into your care, but it is really important to feel okay and to understand that it's a really good idea to still include that person in the ways that you talk about what the child needs. But also at the same time to say, I'm here right now. I can't take away your big feelings, but I will stay with you and I will try to help you calm down because I understand how much you miss your mom, or how scared you might feel, or how overwhelming this is. And I think another thing that's important to do, if at all possible, is to try to make sure that each child has one person who can be that child's safe person. So as much as, as we've talked about how it's important to establish routines and to tell kids about what's going to happen, the staff that are coming, the staff that are going, the other children who are coming and going, if there is a way that that one staff person can really, be a child's person, be the one that has the time to do that extra thinking, to understand that child, to explain that child to other staff, that can also help in terms of a child really developing a sense of safety under these very trying circumstances. The next slide. So to continue, talking about helping children to cope through making sense of separation and loss. I think sort of the overarching, we just gave you some examples of things that you might try saying to children, but I think the overarching idea about all of this is to try to think about that particular child and what the separation and loss means to this child in terms of their particular temperament, their age, but not even so much their age, but kind of where they are developmentally, to be able to recognize this particular child's level of tolerance to stimuli. Do they need to eat alone at a table with just one grown-up helping them eat? Is it too much for them to be sitting at a table with lots of other children? Where are they in terms of their receptive and expressive language and their social, cultural, and linguistic content? In all the different ways that you can, try to let this child know that there'll be someone to take care of their needs, to use play, body language, books that you might use. Also, if there's books that have a lot of words, to make up different stories with the kids that make more sense for whatever it is that they're struggling with. And also, if you don't know things, to communicate to them that you're trying to figure it out. So, for example, if you are, you have a child who's really struggling to eat, none of the food looks appealing to them, you're worried about them, they're falling apart because they're starving, to be able to say to them, you are safe here. I know that you are hungry. I don't know what you like to eat. I'm trying to figure that out. Maybe we can figure that out together. To really try to put into words what you're seeing, and try to connect the child's feelings with their behavior. If you see children who are biting, hitting, crying, they don't have words, they're really upset, to be able, again, to talk about their parents, to say, I know that you're really upset, you're confused about what's going on, you don't know who all these people are, you're really missing your mommy. I know you would really like to be with your mommy again. We're working on that. I know your mommy's trying hard to find you. I wish I could tell you when she will find you. But now you're safe here with me. Really put into words things that communicate that you understand the separation and the loss, and that you still are going to do your best to keep these kids safe and communicate that they are safe, even though it's extremely hard for them to understand what is happening to them. Next slide.
So Marcy has already mentioned some of these points, and what we want for these children, what we would like to offer to these children is a possibility of master or their fears, make a meaning of what has happened to them, convey a sense of safety and hope, and then also take away the burden from that they many times experience because, again, of their young age. Children tend to believe that the world evolves around them. That is how children operate cognitively at when they are very young. So it's not unlikely that children are thinking that if their parents disappear, in this case, it's because they did something wrong, and it's part of their magical thinking. So it's so important, number one, to hold, as I was mentioning before, I was bringing up Luisito's mother in this case, respect and hold that relationship for Luisito, and as Marcy was mentioning, Say, for instance, I know, Luisito, that you are missing your mommy or missing your family. It's so confusing. I am here to be with you, to help you, and many adults are trying to find mommy. It was not your fault. And most importantly, just, these ideas that we want to be truthful, that we cannot make false promises, because many times we don't know where the parents are, or we don't know what is about to happen, but that we know that even if the parents are not here, the children are thinking about them, that internally they are holding their parents, and then we need to be respectful of that relationship and sensitive to the loss and the fear that the separation has caused. Next slide, please.
Serve to build relationships. So I think that, so I will quickly go through these, but I think that they are really about the time that you spend with a child, to try to have one-on-one interrupted play time with, as we've talked about before, developmentally appropriate toys, not so much about their age, but what they're able to do. Try to just be with them, leave agendas outside, and just spend time with the child so they feel that they are special and can build a connection with you. Can learn about children a lot by letting them take the lead and have choices about what they want to play with. Provide opportunities for them to connect with other children. Talk to children in their language, in a calm tone of voice, as we've talked about with all the narrations, and identifying what they're feeling. If children will allow it, cuddle, touch, have close physical contact, and, take that slow. The child may want to hold your hand, and, in a few days they may want to sit on your lap. You have to take your cues from that child. When children pick toys or communicate in different ways, let them know that you're so interested, that you want to know more about them. And all of these different ways of approaching them will help to build confidence and trust. And again, it's very much about your tone of voice and your body language that will help build a relationship that will help a child feel safer and want to spend time with the grown-ups in their orbit. Next slide.
Now we are going to spend some time in thinking again about the very, and we don't have at this point the time, and is not the focus of this talk, but then about a little bit about the impact of the work on you. And this is very difficult work because of, we have been talking about the laws and about working with young kids who are not able to tell us in words about their experience, and many times we are guessing and looking for an opportunity to connect with them, and that doesn't work, and it can get, as we were saying at the beginning of the presentation, this can be very stressful. So the importance of paying attention to your reactions, to be aware as you are in relationship with these children, to be aware of your feelings and then your reactions, particularly when there have been moments of rupture, when something didn't go well with a child. It's so hard to sometimes to not be hard on ourselves and then to feel that that we did something wrong. And so we just want to highlight and normalize that rupture is part of relationships, and to be in a relationship with these children is not different. So that rupture, it is bound to happen as you are working with these children. And then again, the importance of self-awareness and of having the time to be very intentional about exploring how you are feeling in relationship to your work, in relationship to the children. That is okay sometimes to feel some negative feelings, or to feel tired, or to feel upset, and then to keep an awareness of those feelings, and to find possibly a trusted colleague, a trusted supervisor, if possible, to be able to process those feelings. And then the importance of avoid showing negative feelings or rejection to the children. It can happen, but because again, they are at such vulnerable place, and they are very young, and they are paying attention and are very sensitive to the cues that adults are giving or showing to them. And that if rupture has happened, as I was mentioned before, you can always reconnect with the child, that you can take a break, talk to someone, and then come back and identify an enjoyable activity with the child, and share a moment with the child, keep the child company. And if the child has already language, you can engage in a conversation, in a appropriate conversation about what happened. Or you can simply verbalize in words what happened, and explain, like you were, I don't know, like you were thinking about Luisito, like Luisito then was biting and kicking, and maybe he beat a little friend. So you can narrate that and say that, that you were upset, or that everybody was upset, that Luisito was upset, but that now and that you care very much about Luisito, and that you are sorry about what happened, and then that you are interested to understand what was bothering him. And I am sure that you are implementing many of these strategies, and probably you can articulate them better than me, but we just wanted to include this piece as a very important piece in relation to the work with this particular population, and acknowledge that, again, that it can bring many feelings for us, and that it can be sad, it can be very rewarding too, and that hopefully you can have the space to explore how you are feeling in relationship to the work with, again, with trusted adults or a trusted supervisor. Next slide, please. So in relation to what I was mentioning in the other slide, it's important to think about organizational strategies that can support all of us who are working directly with children, and particularly for the staff who is providing care to children in care. And we have mentioned the importance of paying attention to the ratio between children and caregiver. It's important to provide training and consultation to develop the skills of the staff. Not many of us were necessarily trained in child development or early childhood trauma. It requires special attention and special training. So opportunities like these, or opportunities just to have a better understanding of child development and the impact of child development in very young children is very important. Then also paying attention to inequities that sometimes happen, particularly with staff who might speak 2 or 3 languages, and they might be an additional burdens might be placed on them in terms of like the number of children that they might be serving, or the additional tasks that they might have as translators, cultural brokers, in addition to all the other responsibilities that they might have, and to create policies that prevent the impact of or address the impact of the work on the staff, and to address, for instance, secondary traumatic stress. So there are opportunities to talk about secondary traumatic stress or burnout, or as part of the work, and not something that a staff person needs to be ashamed of or needs to hide, but that there is an opportunity for the organization to think about how we can identify secondary traumatic stress, or how can we identify the impact that the work is having on us, and how we can talk about it. So it's part of our organizational culture, and we are, and how together we are going to implement practices to address it. And again, this idea of implementing diversity-informed reflective practice and supervision. Reflective supervision is a practice that has been identified as having the possibility of reducing the impact of secondary traumatic stress, and then also a safe place for staff and for leaders in an organization to take a look at their own biases, at their own values and beliefs, and how, as we were mentioning before, how we can look at those in a very intentional way, and how those values and beliefs are really contributing to the work or getting in the way of the work. And then this idea about the importance of implementing screening and assessment protocols that can help us making decisions about where to refer the children, or what kind of help the children might need, that is really reflective of their specific developmental, socio-cultural needs. And as Marcy was saying, we might not be able to know all the trauma history of the child, but again, they are telling us so much through their behaviors, and it's important to understand their development, for instance, so we can make appropriate referrals. And then, of course, to implement trauma-informed, evidence-based interventions, but again, keeping a lens that is important to adapt those interventions to the realities and the needs of the children. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Marcy and Carmen. I think you both have done a really great job in sort of talking to us about some of the important considerations for these children. And I think one of the things we wanted to do is sort of gather some questions and make sure we provide as much information to everyone as possible. So the first question that I have, and hopefully you can sort of briefly just give us a little bit of clarity on the age group that you really are focused in on for this webinar, and just to help explain that a little bit for our audience.
Yeah, the focus of this webinar are children, and I think covers prenatally, like what the impact of trauma in immigrant families prenatally and through age 5.
Thanks, Carmen. And then maybe could you also explain a little bit the context of trauma from separation, especially when a parent decides or elects to be removed or return to their home country without their child or children? Obviously, because of this webinar, we know that some of these children aren't teenagers, but actually pretty young children left in the care of the government because family caregivers were not deemed suitable. So can you just talk a little bit about the context of trauma for these children?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that I want to highlight is that there is so much that we don't know, in that just from the accounts of the families that I have worked with, that many times parents might be returned to the home country not because that was their wish, and their children stayed here, and that might not have been their decision, but that is how things happened. And that in those cases where we might know that a parent willingly left a child here, it's important, again, to keep an open mind and to imagine all the reasons why that might have happened, and to keep in mind that many of these families, or most of these families, engage in a very dangerous journey because living in their countries was not safe any longer. So it's possible that for many of these parents, or some of these parents who left and didn't go take their children with them, that they are thinking that the children are going to be safe here because returning to their country of origin might mean death, or might mean extreme poverty, or extreme the possibility of multiple dangers. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. Thanks so much, Carmen. I have a couple of additional questions from our audience. Maybe, Marcy, you could help with the next one. Do you have any recommendations for screenings and assessments that would be particularly useful for this age group?
Absolutely. I think a couple of things. I think that one of the important reasons for doing screening and assessments would be for staff to be able to understand what typically developing kids look like, in a sense, and not to compare the kids that we are working with these kids, because they've been through so much, and we don't know, in their socio-cultural context, what typical development looks like. Our screening and assessments are normed on, kids pretty much in the United States and what is expected for them. But what it really helps with is to be able to identify where kids are developmentally so that we can support their growth. And so screenings that work for that are something called the ASQ3 and the ASQ-SE. These are screenings that after staff has spent some time with kids and they can observe their behaviors, it's a screening that organizes their observations and allows them to get a handle, again, not on where they're supposed to be according to our developmental trajectories, but to really identify the things that they're seeing in the kids in terms of what are their developmental capacities. And so the ASQs really do a nice job of that.
Thanks, Marcy. I have one final question from our audience. It's, is there a trauma-informed intervention or treatment for children who are in care for just really a brief period of time? So thinking maybe some of the kids, it sounds like, are in care for 2 months, 60 days or less. And what kinds of things, interventions or treatments would you recommend for these kids?
And I think that's a really good question. Many of the evidence-based treatments that we would use with children this age are relationship-based, and they really depend on there being a caregiver that a child is going to stay with. So they're better for, even if a child's been in care for a while, when the child is reunified with their parent, or if that doesn't end up being the case, when they are placed with where they're going to be permanently. But for our kids, as they're little and they're in care, I guess I would recommend a couple of things. There are different modes of treatment that can help kids: art therapy, movement and dance therapy. However, I think that the stress of that is our typical way of approaching therapy is that we take a child by themselves and we put them in a room with a stranger who we hope that they'll develop a relationship over time for an hour a week. So I would say that to think about interventions for these kids, again, I would think about a staff person staying with the child, and if they're going to be seen by an expert who has some other modality of training to help kids with their emotion regulation, which I think is really probably the biggest need at the point that kids are in care, that it would make sense to think about it as not taking that child who's already anxious and upset and having them spend an hour a week with another stranger, but to think about how to do that in a more coordinated way and a modality that could focus on their emotion regulation in a safe way.
Thank you so much. So at this point, that actually concludes today's webinar, and I would like to take a moment to thank the Irving Harris Foundation, Carmen Rosa Noroña, and Dr. Marcy Safyer. I would also like to thank each of you for joining us today. Please remember to log on to the NCTSN Learning Center and complete the evaluation and CE post-test for this webinar. Thank you again for joining us today.